Colonel Wilkerson, let us get started with what happened to Scott Ritter, friend of this show. Now, his prevention by the Department of State comes as there have been many announcements from the United States and NATO around escalations, greenlighting Ukraine's use of long-range missiles into Russian territory, and then a leaked report about NATO forming land corridors through Europe to rush to the Russian border in case of an eventual war between NATO and Russia. How do you see Scott Ritter's persecution by the Department of State within the context of this overall conflict going on in Ukraine?
Let me pick up on your last comment before I go to that. NATO rushing anything, armored columns, battalions of infantry, air defense, is just stunning to me. Well coordinated towards anybody's border. The business with Ritter is really disturbing. As I said on another interview of yesterday or day before, I got stopped going to Cuba when I was working track 2 diplomacy for President Obama, trying to bring about a rapprochement with Cuba. We had gotten to the point where we could, out of Miami, travel regularly, but it was onerous. It was difficult because they would always throw up something. Several times, and one time in particular, I had the same thing happen to me that Scott did. And I don't know, I was just in possession of my faculties. So I challenged the gentleman who presented himself as being from Customs and Border Patrol. And I told him what I was doing, and he took my documents for a while. I was really worried. And he came back and he said, "Okay, you're cleared, go ahead." I don't know what he did, but this is the kind of way they operate. And with Scott, it was even more egregious. It was worse because they confiscated his only travel document, his American passport, and they didn't give him a receipt. And as I heard it told by Scott and others, they didn't actually know who had given them the instructions to do what they were doing, including within the Customs and Border Patrol, who have an office there at JFK where Scott was transporting himself through. So it just smacks of amateur hour. It smacks of last minute attempt to do something to derail Scott's legitimate trip to this Petersburg economic conference. And as Judge Napolitano pointed out on his show numerous times, it violates at least half a dozen of the constitutional provisions for protection of American citizens, not least of which is you can't do that without a valid warrant or without just cause, reasonable cause, we call it, or even reasonable suspicion. And what was the reasonable suspicion of, if there was even reasonable suspicion? And why was there no redress? Now, the question comes to me, it's very difficult. He's been robbed of his ability to travel now, which is another abridgment of the Constitution, without due course. So how does he get his passport back? He doesn't even really know, other than Anthony Blinken, who took it. And he doesn't even really know why they took it, other than the speculation, and I think it's more than speculation, that this group formed in Ukraine with U.S. connivance and monetary support that invented this new term, information terrorism, has caused a new regime to exist, one perhaps even more onerous than the one we put in place during the time I was serving President George W. Bush. And we had prisoners galore who were innocent of anything other than being fought on the battlefield in Guantanamo. So my question to myself as I was listening to this explanation was, okay, when do they start showing up in Guantanamo? When indeed do I show up in Guantanamo as a, quote, information terrorist? This is absolute malarkey, but it's very dangerous malarkey. And Scott is maybe one of the first victims of it.
Yeah. Well, you were the former chief of staff to Colin Powell. You've been on the inside here. Could you talk about this given that this is happening at such a key moment, it feels like in the US's overall foreign policy, if we can even call it a strategy, in Ukraine toward Russia. Vladimir Putin has said that the response to all of these escalations, this kind of rolling escalation of late, especially with the green lighting of US and NATO weapons onto Russian territory, that the response could be asymmetric warfare. From your knowledge and what you've been studying with regard to this conflict, and of course your experience, what could he mean here in terms of Russia's response to this crossing or this latest crossing of Russia's red line?
I hope he just means that he's making a point, a valid point, that he has other weapons at his disposal, if you will. But since Russian doctrine in the 2013, 2014, 2015 period, which the Finns and the Swedes and the Swiss were studying, they had observers on the battlefield, as I recall. And some of them came to America, I think it was 2012 or 2013, and I happened to be in the briefing that they gave on the development of Russian doctrine. Among other things, they alerted us to the fact that taking shape, and now has taken shape, is a doctrinal statement within the Russian body of doctrine that should a country, and you know who they mean, achieve a penetration within the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is their equivalent of NATO, Russia being the most prominent member, as we are the most prominent member of NATO, a penetration into that CSTO area because of the overwhelming advantage, and here you know it's NATO, of precision guided munitions at that time as compared to Russia. Russia would simply blunt the point of the attack or the flanks of the attack, perhaps both, and maybe even some of the rear area with tactical nuclear weapons. People tried to scream at me and tell me that this is when I revealed this, it wasn't classified. It was a briefing by our friends and allies. When I tried to reveal this in some places where neocons hung out, they were like, "Oh, that's crap. The Russians haven't got a doctrine of nuclear use like that. That would be first use." I said, "Yeah, well, you better hope that's the case if you're planning on invading the CSTO, because I take them at their word." Well, Putin's now saying that's the word. Putin's now saying that if you were to start this thing on a regional basis with NATO as a major partner in the now lost to Russia Ukraine conflict, it would change the power equation. And as the Russians used to say when they were the Soviet Union, it would change the correlation of forces. Therefore, I would be perfectly within my right to do whatever I want to with your invasion or your attack or your augmentation of Ukraine. Now let's back up and look at something else. He's had the right under the understood laws of war for some time to attack NATO countries. Anywhere someone is being trained in an F-16 or in a Leopard tank or in a Centurion tank or whatever, in London, in Poland, in the Baltic states, wherever this is happening, or anywhere where munitions are being produced at plants in NATO countries or any country that are being introduced into the Ukraine conflict and then fired at Russian forces or used on Russian forces, they have a right to attack that plant or that airfield or that training facility. Their perfect right to do so because it's being used against them. Now, they're arguing essentially what we're arguing now, that if Russia's attacking from out of the homeland, the motherland, then Ukraine ought to be allowed to hit targets in the motherland. I'd buy that argument if it was Ukrainian produced munitions, but it's not. It's munitions in large part and billions of dollars from the United States in particular, but also from the EU coming into Ukraine from outside. So now you've opened this thing up. So Putin has been very restrained. He could have hit these places. Now, I'm sure he's thinking he does not want to escalate. He has been so systematic in saying that what he's doing in Ukraine has nothing to do with territorial aggrandizement, other than he has to take the territory to protect his citizens in Ukraine. That's his rationale. He does not want Ukraine. He does not want to have to manage it post hostilities. He knows that would be catastrophic. The Ukrainians have produced some of the most bloodthirsty guerrillas in the history of warfare over the last 200 years alone. He knows he doesn't want that territory. He couldn't manage it. He's not interested in territory. He's interested in security. He's made that point all along. And lately, he's been making the point that he's ready to talk. And he's ready to talk as long as he's allowed to sit down at the other end of the table. I mean, this business of going to Switzerland, for example, without Russia is absurd. It's absurd. And the rest of the world is deeming it absurd because they're not coming. I like Lula's statement. Why would I want to go? Russia's not going to be there. This is true nonsense, really, and it's nonsense more or less manifested by the United States of America, and to a large extent, its poodle dog, London.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And what's so interesting about this too is that, as you said, not only has Putin been very clear that it's not about territory, but you also have on the other side a pretty big lack of clarity. For example, I don't know if you caught Joe Biden's very incoherent interview with Time magazine, but in that interview, he was very defensive when it was suggested that it's a troubling time in the conflict for NATO and for the United States with regard to Ukraine. And he immediately said, "What are you talking about? Russia's military is decimated." Colonel Wilkerson, could you clarify what could Joe Biden be thinking here when he says these words, if anything at all? And what is the reality of the situation then? Because it seems to be pretty far from what Joe Biden is asserting to Time magazine and what he's been asserting since the beginning of this conflict.
I have a hard time believing that a coherent and thinking president of the United States would say things like that. So I have to believe one of two things. Either he's not coherent and not thinking clear-headedly. He's, as Barbara Tuchman so famously said about World War I, he's wooden-headed. Or, and I tend to come down on this latter reason, or a combination of the two, but more emphasis on this latter reason, his advisors are fools. And since I know that Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are fools, I come down, as I said, pretty hard on that side. And he's only getting his information from fools. Now, let me add to that. The 4 stars in the armed forces of the United States, who are a basket case of wooden-headedness and stupidity. Just look at what they've been doing of late. 26 out of 32, 80% of the recently retiring flag officers at that rank level went to military contractors post-retirement. This is their dream. This is their glory. Look at Admiral Burke, who used to boast that he commanded more maritime forces. He was commander of all the NATO naval forces than Horatio Nelson. Well, I have news for him. One thing is historical analogy is kind of stupid because the French fleet was a lot bigger than Horatio Nelson's. So I would have said bigger than Napoleon's fleet, not Horatio Nelson's. But nonetheless, now he's up on charges. It looks like he's been involved in corruption and been offered a $500,000 a year job because of that corruption after his retirement. Now, this guy, I thought, was one of the last 4 stars in the United States Navy that was worth a damn. Now I've got to revisit that opinion completely and cast him with the rest of the fools. Look at Afghanistan. 20 years, no one held to account, no one fired, no one ripped up. One person was sort of pseudo-fired. But and then look at Iraq, all the 4 stars there, the 3 stars there that came home and were service chiefs or something else, got their promotions, got their big job in the military industrial complex. No one punished, no one held accountable. We have fools running the United States military today. So I got to believe that Biden is getting a whole plate full of really bad advice. You had David Petraeus out there months ago saying there was no way Russia was going to prevail. Ukraine was going to prevail. Well, David, I'm sorry. I knew you lied about Iraq when you were telling me at the State Department that Iraqi battalions were ready for action. And my spy in Baghdad was telling me that 10 to 30% on any given day of your Iraqi battalions were AWOL. So I know David Petraeus lies for a profession, but it's a combination of things like that. The remarks that Biden made are simply absurd. Look at the correlation of forces once again, which I was looking at on the day of the invasion and said, no way, Ukraine prevails, not unless NATO in force joins it, and then it'll be touch and go, because it's 140 to 150 million nation with 11 time zones and a latent industrial base that now is cooking on all 8 cylinders, by the way, against less than 40 million who most of their industrial base was shipped off to the new Russia once the Soviet Union stood down, along with their nuclear weapons. And what remained in Ukraine was producing heavy equipment and such for the Russians. So this is absurd for any military professional, unless he's interested in politics and interested in getting a really good, well-paying job in the military-industrial complex, who, by the way, are making billions off this Ukraine conflict. Unless that's his motivation, it's absolute insanity for him to stand up there and say, with that correlation of forces, that Ukraine is going to prevail. No way Ukraine is going to prevail. So to have the president at this late moment, I looked at a map yesterday of what the Russians have right now and what they could take within the next 30 to 60 days. Port of Odessa is going to fall. Ukraine then will have no port on the Black Sea. Forget about trying to ship your grain and other things out, because if the Russians want to stop you, they'll stop you. They will own all the ports. You'll have to use trains and buses and trucks and everything else. And no one in the EU is going to like that, because then you're going to be competing with their farmers, and that's going to cause a real problem. This is a nightmare taking shape that the United States has largely crafted, along with, I can't leave this out ever, its British poodle, and Rishi Sunak in particular, but the guys before him too. This is a disaster. And we need to recognize that and call for a ceasefire, which Putin, I'm sure, will agree to. Listened to him this morning, driving back from Annapolis. I listened to him. And he essentially said that as long as he got a seat at the table and was able to prevail in the serious matters that he considers serious, at least partially, if not wholly, he's willing to do it. He's willing to sit down. I know he's said so many times what those serious matters are. That should be no problem for us, other than we have to eat a lot of crow because it'll look like we lost. And I fear at the end of the day, that might be Biden's motivation. He is so scared, as Lyndon Baines Johnson was, of getting branded by the American people as a cutter and runner from a conflict. You know, he cut and run from Ukraine after saying all these things about it, essential, existential, and so forth. It's Hitler all over again and so forth, calling Putin that. After saying all those things, then sitting down after a ceasefire and negotiating a peace, which will be at least 50-50, if not 60-40 for Russia, that might cost him the election in November. And that is the only thing Joe Biden really cares about. Not America, not democracy, liberal or otherwise, not our real security. If he cared about our real security, he wouldn't be bogged down in Ukraine and Gaza through proxies, but nonetheless bogged down monetarily and equipment-wise. If he cared, he wouldn't be in either of these conflicts the way he is. He'd be focused entirely on China, and he'd be building up the U.S. armed forces to meet China if it has to someday in the future. He's not doing that. So he is interested in one thing, and only one thing: getting reelected.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.